I was 10 seconds away from being escorted out of the building. My CEO, a man I had admired from a distance for 4 years, was looking at me with pure loathing. "You're telling me my boyfriend is a thief based on footage you weren't authorized to record?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. I realized then that I hadn't just uncovered a betrayal, I had walked right into a trap where I was the only victim. Let me back up. My name is Daniel Reeves, IT manager at Axiom Partners, a mid-sized defense consulting firm headquartered in Arlington, Virginia. We don't build weapons, we build strategies, bid proposals, procurement frameworks, federal contract pipelines worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The kind of work where a single leaked document doesn't just cost money, it costs careers, sometimes more. I'd been at Axiom for 6 years, worked my way up from a junior systems analyst running cable through drop ceilings to managing a team of 11, overseeing the entire network infrastructure. I knew this building the way a surgeon knows anatomy. Every server rack, every access log, every anomaly. That's how I saw it. 3 weeks before the worst day of my professional life, I was running a routine bandwidth audit on the executive floor. Nothing glamorous. You'd be surprised how many C-suite people stream Netflix during board prep hours. I was cross-referencing upload spikes against user IDs when I noticed something that didn't fit. There was a recurring data transfer, small packets, staggered intervals, always between 11:47 p.m. and 12:15 a.m., originating from a guest device registered to Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb, the CEO's boyfriend. Marcus had been given temporary visitor access 6 months ago, standard protocol for executive partners, enough to use the Wi-Fi in the private lounge on the 32nd floor, nothing more. He wasn't supposed to be on the network at midnight. He wasn't supposed to be uploading anything, and he definitely wasn't supposed to be bouncing transfers through a masked relay node that pointed, after 2 hours of patient tracework, to a server cluster registered to Nexus Strategic Group, our biggest competitor. I sat with that information for 4 days. I turned it over in my head the way you turn over a stone you're afraid to look under. Marcus wasn't an employee. He wasn't a contractor. He was the CEO's boyfriend. Charming, well-dressed, always perched on the edge of Ethan Cole's desk as if he belonged there. Ethan trusted him completely. Anyone could see that. The whole office could see it. Ethan Cole, CEO of Axiom Partners, 41 years old, former Army intelligence officer, Harvard MBA, the kind of man who made every room feel smaller just by entering it. I'd worked in the same building as him for 6 years and spoken to him directly maybe a dozen times. Each conversation had left me slightly off balance, in a way I'd learned to ignore. I told myself I was doing my job. I set up a passive capture on the guest network, technically a gray area in our security policy, but not explicitly prohibited for a network administrator investigating anomalous activity. I documented everything. Timestamps, file sizes, relay paths. Then I made my second mistake. My first was caring. My second was trusting that caring would be enough. I also noticed that Marcus wasn't alone in this. Kevin Marsh, our director of business development, had been accessing the secure bid repository at odd hours, using credentials that should have been locked to his workstation. He'd been copying RFP response files, the full packages, not summaries, to a personal cloud drive. I flagged it, documented it, added it to the folder. When I requested an urgent meeting with Ethan, his assistant pushed me to Thursday. I said it was a security matter. I got moved to Wednesday afternoon. I walked into that office with a laptop, a printed summary, and 4 years of professional credibility. Marcus was already there. That should have been my warning. Marcus was always just there, leaning against the window, coffee in hand, smile easy and practiced. He looked at my laptop bag and something shifted in his eyes, just for a second. Then it was gone, and he was all warmth again. "Daniel," Ethan said, "you wanted to discuss a security concern?" I set up the laptop. I walked Ethan through the logs, the timestamps, the relay node, the Nexus connection. I kept my voice even, my language technical, my presentation clean. Ethan's expression didn't change. He listened with the same controlled stillness he brought to everything. Then Marcus laughed. It was a gentle laugh, sympathetic almost. He shook his head slowly like I'd said something sad. "Baby, I've been dealing with this for weeks. Kevin has been. Look, I didn't want to say anything because I felt bad for him, but he's been showing up on floors he has no business being on, watching. My friend Kayla in HR said he asked her about my visitor registration twice." He turned to me with practiced pity. "I know you're going through something, Daniel, but this?" He gestured at the laptop. "This is a story you built because you can't accept that Ethan is happy." The silence in that room was its own entity. "The footage," I said, keeping my voice flat. "I have upload logs and—" "The footage you recorded without authorization," Ethan said. His tone had dropped, changed. "On a guest device, in a personal capacity. In my professional capacity as you are not cleared to surveil individuals on executive-granted access without a formal security review request submitted through compliance." He stood up. "Marcus, would you give us a minute?" Marcus gave me one last look, not pity anymore, something colder, and stepped out. What followed was the quietest evisceration of my career. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He told me that my actions constituted a violation of visitor privacy protocols, that I had stepped far outside my authorized scope, and that he was seriously considering whether my role at Axiom was still appropriate. I sat there, and I took it, because what else was I going to do? Tell him his boyfriend had just outmaneuvered both of us in real time? He wouldn't have heard it. HR was called. A formal warning was placed in my file. I was told to surrender my copies of the documentation pending compliance review, which I knew meant they would disappear. I didn't surrender all of them. I walked back to my office on the 14th floor, sat down at my desk, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. My team pretended not to notice. I had just tried to protect a man who saw me as a problem. The worst part wasn't the humiliation, it was that I still believed I was right. 7 days later, Axiom lost the Franklin Defense Logistics contract, $340 million, gone to Nexus Strategic Group, which came in with a bid that was $2.1 million lower than ours. That margin, on a contract that size, wasn't luck. It wasn't better pricing. It was surgical precision built on inside information. I heard it through the building's nervous system, the way bad news travels in corporate environments, through whispered hallway conversations and tightened faces in the elevator. By 4 p.m., the executive floor had the energy of a hospital waiting room. I stayed late, not unusual for me. I was running a scheduled server maintenance cycle that actually needed my hands on it, and I had nowhere else to be. My apartment in Roslyn was quiet in the way empty spaces are when you've been spending all your mental energy somewhere else. It was 10:47 p.m. when my office door opened. No knock, just the door, and then Ethan Cole standing in the frame. He looked different, still impeccable, charcoal suit, no tie, sleeves rolled to the forearm, but something around his eyes was exhausted in a way I'd never seen on him before. He looked at my cluttered office, the secondary monitors covered in log windows, the cold cup of coffee I'd forgotten about 2 hours ago, and something in his expression shifted. "Reeves," he said. "Cole?" I didn't stand up. Professional courtesy had limits. HR is closed. He almost smiled at that. Almost. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, which told me everything. No witnesses. "Franklin went to Nexus," he said. "I heard." "Their bid was $2.1 million under ours. Our internal estimate never left the executive suite. 3 people had access to the final numbers. Me, our CFO, and Kevin Marsh." He paused. "Kevin Marsh, who you flagged in the same report I dismissed." I didn't say anything. I let that sit. Ethan walked to the chair across from my desk, the one my junior techs used during incident reviews, and he sat down. That alone told me how far outside normal this conversation was. Ethan Cole didn't sit in subordinate chairs. "Marcus had dinner with someone from Nexus 2 weeks ago," he said quietly. "I found the calendar notification. He said it was an old college friend. I believed him." He looked at his hands. I've been believing him for 18 months. Still, I said nothing. I had already been burned once for speaking first. "You need to know if you still have the documentation," Ethan said. He looked up. Those gray eyes, sharp, unreadable under normal circumstances, were stripped of their usual armor. "The copies you made before compliance took the rest." "What happened to seriously reconsidering my role at Axiom?" He didn't flinch. "That's a fair response." "It's not a response, it's a question." "I was wrong." He said it cleanly, without decoration, no qualifier, no perhaps, no given certain perspectives, just "I was wrong." "Marcus played me. He knew you were coming. He positioned himself before you could say a word." A pause. "He's done it before, hasn't he? With other people who got too close." I opened my desk drawer, pulled out a flash drive and set it on the desk between us. Ethan looked at it for a long moment, then he looked at me. "What do you need?" he asked. "Your full cooperation and zero interference from anyone else. This doesn't go through HR, legal, or compliance until we're finished." "Agreed. And you accept that some of what I'm going to show you is going to be difficult." Something passed across his face. Pain, maybe. The kind that comes with already knowing the answer to a question you've been afraid to ask. "I know," he said. We started that night. The first thing I did was scan his office. Ethan watched from the doorway while I moved through the space with a broadband RF detector and a nonlinear junction detector I'd requisitioned from our physical security team under the pretense of a routine sweep. I found 4 devices, 2 audio bugs in the lamp base and behind the HVAC vent panel, 1 compact camera mounted inside the smoke detector housing, angled at his desk, 1 keylogger installed in the wireless receiver port on his desktop keyboard. I documented each one, photographed them in place. Then I removed them. When I held up the camera from the smoke detector, a device no larger than a shirt button, Ethan stared at it with the controlled expression of a man processing something he'd rather throw across the room. "That's been there how long?" he asked. "Based on the dust accumulation, at least 4 months." 4 months. That meant Marcus hadn't just been opportunistic, he'd been systematic. Everything Ethan had said, planned, reviewed, or decided at his own desk had been captured. "Kevin Marsh," I said. "We need to address him tonight." "Kevin is in Cincinnati until Thursday for the Henderson pitch." "Good. He'll get to a desk with read-only access and a network quarantine on his device. We'll let him think it's a system migration glitch." I looked at Ethan. "You're comfortable with that?" "Do it." I also pulled Marcus's visitor access card. Formally, the system would show a credential sync error, the kind of minor IT friction that happens in buildings with aging badge readers. In practice, it meant Marcus couldn't get past the lobby without Ethan physically walking him in. Every entry, every exit, logged with a human chaperone. Ethan understood what that meant. He didn't comment on it. The bait was simpler. We left one thing deliberately unchanged: the password to the secure bid repository, the one Marcus had been accessing through Kevin's credentials. We let it sit, visible and accessible, like an unlocked door at the end of a long hallway. But we put a sensor on the door. Any access to that repository from an external credential would trigger a silent alert to my phone. No lockout, no notification to the user, just a quiet ping in my pocket and a timestamp. We changed the contents. This was the part that took the most time and the most precision. Axiom was currently developing a bid response for the Morrison Federal Infrastructure contract, $280 million, due in 3 weeks. Real numbers, real strategy, real work my team and Ethan's people had been building for 2 months. We created a parallel version, identical formatting, identical language, but with a core pricing structure that was subtly, fatally wrong. Not obviously wrong, not something that would be caught with a casual read. The error was embedded in the subcontractor allocation matrix, a section bid reviewers on Nexus's side would use directly to build their own counterproposal. If they submitted a bid based on our poisoned data, they would underprice their own overhead by a margin that looked competitive, but was structurally unsound. They would win nothing, they would lose millions trying. Ethan sat across from me while I built it, watching the screen. Occasionally, he'd ask a question, a real one, not performative. He had a sharp strategic mind underneath the authority. I had always suspected that, and now I was seeing it up close. We worked until 2 a.m. When we finally leaned back, the trap was set, and the building was silent around us. "You do this kind of thing often?" Ethan asked. "Run honeypots?" Third time. First two were disgruntled insiders trying to sell network diagrams to competitors. One in 2021, one in 2023. I looked at him. This is the first time the insider had executive-level cover. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I should have listened to you the first time." "Yes," I said, "you should have." He didn't argue with that. The next 4 nights were unlike anything I'd experienced in 6 years at Axiom. We didn't talk about what we were doing in terms of betrayal or heartbreak. We talked about data, architecture, strategy. The Morrison bid, which needed to be genuinely strong alongside its poisoned twin. We had to win the contract ourselves, not just tank Nexus. A victory that looked too convenient would raise questions. So we worked on both things simultaneously, the real bid and the trap. Ethan was good at this, better than I'd expected, though I'm not sure why I'd set the bar low. He'd spent years in Army intelligence before the private sector. He understood deception as a discipline. He thought in layers. I brought the technical architecture. He brought the strategic framing. Together, we were building something that felt genuinely airtight. On the second night, I was deep in a nested formula structure when I became aware that Ethan had gone quiet behind me. Not the silence of distraction, the silence of attention. "What?" I asked, without looking up. "Nothing," he said. Then, after a pause, "How long have you been able to type like that?" I glanced down at my hands. "Like what?" "That fast, without looking at the keys." Since I was 17, I kept working." You stare at keyboards when you type." "I know. I've been watching you for 4 days and I've never seen you look down once." I didn't have a response to that, so I kept typing. On the third night, he brought coffee. Real coffee, not the break room burn, something from the place on Wilson Boulevard that stayed open until midnight. He set a cup next to my monitor without asking how I took it, and it was exactly right. Black, no sugar. I looked at the cup, then at him. "You asked Angela," his assistant. "She mentioned you'd turned down the flavored creamers at the Q3 review catering," I extrapolated. That was a very Ethan Cole way to pay attention to someone. We didn't talk about Marcus, not directly. But on the 4th night, when we were waiting on a background process to run, and the office was dim and quiet, Ethan said, "When did you know about him?" 11 weeks ago, I said. The first bandwidth anomaly. He was silent. "I asked," I said. He did. He looked at the window. The DC skyline at 1 a.m., the Capitol dome lit in the distance. I thought the way he always knew things was because he was perceptive. That's what I told myself, that he paid attention. A pause. He was paying attention, just not the way I thought. I didn't offer comfort. I wasn't equipped to, and he wasn't asking for it. What I said instead was, he was strategic. That's actually harder to see than malice. Malice is obvious. Strategy looks like intimacy. Ethan turned from the window and looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. "That's an interesting thing to know," he said quietly. I went back to my keyboard. But the air in the room had changed, and I noticed it, and I suspected he did too. Day 6. The alert hit my phone at 9:14 a.m. The poisoned repository had been accessed. External credential, Kevin Marsh's, used remotely from an IP that traced back to a commercial VPN service popular with people who thought they were being clever about their digital footprint. Kevin was still in Cincinnati, which meant someone had his credentials who wasn't Kevin. I texted Ethan a single word: tonight. By 3 p.m., we had everything staged. I'd briefed Sandra O'Coffer, our procurement manager, on what she needed to do. Sandra was meticulous, trustworthy, and had been with Axiom longer than I had. She asked 3 questions, got 3 answers, and said, "Tell me when." At 4:30 p.m., Sandra and I took the elevator to the executive floor together. She was carrying a manila folder. I was carrying a flash drive, visibly, obviously, in my hand. Marcus was in Ethan's office. Of course he was. We knocked. Ethan looked up, performed mild surprise with impressive authenticity, and waved us in. "The Morrison final documents," Sandra said, setting the folder on the desk. "And the consolidated data package." I held up the flash drive, set it next to the folder. Marcus was watching, casually, the way he did everything, leaning in the chair across from Ethan's desk, legs crossed, looking like someone who had every right to be in the room. But his eyes tracked the flash drive. "I need to run through a few of the allocation numbers before I sign off," Ethan said. He stood, stretched, looked at me. "Actually, walk with me to grab coffee. I want to talk through the subcontractor matrix on the way back." He looked at Marcus. "Baby, give me 10 minutes?" Marcus smiled. "Take your time." We left. In the elevator, Ethan and I stood side by side and said nothing. The button for the lobby was lit. Ethan asked, "How long do we give him?" "The file is 42 megabytes. On our Wi-Fi with a VPN overhead, 6 to 8 minutes to copy." We gave him 12. We got coffee. Ethan paid. We stood in the lobby cafe, and I watched the minute hand on the clock above the register, and I thought about the trap closing upstairs, like a door on a room that had held a lie for 18 months. When we went back up, the folder was in exactly the same position. The flash drive was still on the desk. Marcus was on his phone. "Everything okay?" Ethan asked. "Perfect," Marcus said. He had no idea. We submitted the real Morrison bid 4 days later. Axiom came in at $247 million. The evaluation committee's decision came back in 11 days, unusually fast, but federal procurement timelines could move when the right pressure was applied, and the technical submission was watertight. We won. Nexus Strategic Group submitted a bid of $231 million. To anyone who didn't know what we'd done, it would look like an aggressive, competitive bid. To us, looking at the internal cost structure we'd embedded in the poison data, it was a number that would require Nexus to perform the contract at a $14 million deficit before accounting for the overhead error in the subcontractor matrix. Their CFO would have seen that eventually, but not before the bid was submitted, not before the contract decision was locked. Nexus lost. Not just the contract, they lost the credibility that came with being the aggressive underbidder who'd apparently miscalculated on a federal contract of that magnitude. In the defense consulting world, that kind of public stumble traveled fast. What happened next, I heard secondhand. Apparently, the man at Nexus who had been running their intelligence operation, a VP of strategic development named Craig Howell, held Marcus personally responsible. The theory, from Howell's perspective, was that Marcus had been feeding them bad data intentionally, that he'd been a double agent for Axiom all along, sabotaging Nexus from the inside while appearing to deliver. It wasn't true, of course. Marcus had believed he was delivering genuine data. He'd been played just as completely as he'd played everyone else, just with better engineering behind it. But Howell didn't know that. The scene that followed, I didn't see it, but 3 people who worked near the Nexus offices in Tyson's Corner apparently did, involved Craig Howell, Marcus Webb, and a very public conversation in a parking garage that ended with Marcus's access badge being thrown at him and Howell walking away calling him a liability. Marcus Webb, who had spent 18 months building what he thought was an impenetrable position, left that parking garage alone. Marcus came back the next morning. I was watching the lobby feed from my office when he walked in. Not as a visitor, he still had no active badge, but he went straight to the front desk and told security he was there to see Ethan Cole. Personal visit. Security called up. Ethan had told them to let him through if he showed up. I made my way to the executive floor. When I stepped off the elevator, I could see through the glass panel into Ethan's office. Marcus was already seated, same chair as always, same easy posture. From the hallway, you wouldn't have known anything was wrong. He looked like exactly who he'd always presented himself as, a man entirely at home in a space that wasn't his. I stood outside the door and waited. Inside, Marcus was talking. I couldn't hear the words through the glass, but I knew the rhythm of it, the reassuring cadence, the measured gestures, the expressions calibrated to project honesty. He'd done this before, countless times, and it had always worked. Ethan sat behind his desk and let him finish. Then he turned the monitor toward Marcus. What Marcus saw was the footage from the security camera I had repositioned 2 days after we swept the office. Not the one Marcus had installed, but mine, placed at an angle that captured the entire desk, including the chair Marcus always occupied. It showed everything from the afternoon of the Morrison file handoff. Marcus reaching for the flash drive the moment we left. Marcus plugging in his own device. Marcus copying the file in under 7 minutes. Marcus replacing everything and resuming his position before we returned. The footage was silent. It didn't need audio. It was exactly what it was. I watched Marcus's face through the glass. He went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, recalibration, an attempt at something that might have been an alternative explanation, and then, finally, stillness. The stillness of someone who is run out of moves. Ethan said something, short. Then he stood and walked to the door. He opened it and looked at Marcus. "You should leave now." Marcus stood slowly. He looked at Ethan for a long moment, not with guilt, I thought, but with something more like frustration. The frustration of a strategy that had failed, not a person who understood what they'd done. He left without looking at me. Ethan watched him go until the elevator doors closed. Then he exhaled, a long, controlled breath, and leaned against the doorframe. "He didn't say anything," I said. "There was nothing to say." Ethan looked at me. He never actually had anything to say. That was always the problem. I just couldn't see it. We stood in the hallway for a moment. The floor was empty. Most of the executive team had cleared out after 6. The building had that late evening quality it got sometimes. The hum of the HVAC, the city light through the windows, the sense of a held breath slowly releasing. The compliance team will want the documentation by end of week. Kevin Marsh's network activity, the access logs, the footage. I can have it packaged and ready. "Tomorrow," Ethan said. "That can wait until tomorrow." "Okay." He turned and looked at me fully then. Not the appraising look of someone evaluating an employee, something else, something I recognized in the way you recognize a thing you've been deliberately not naming. "I've been distracted," he said. I waited. "All week, while we were working," he paused. "I kept watching your hands." There it was. I should have had something composed to say to that. I work in systems. I understand inputs and outputs. I should have been prepared for this particular variable, but standing in the doorway of his office at 7 p.m. with Marcus's absence still fresh in the air, I found that I wasn't prepared at all. "My hands?" I said. "The way you type, the way you work, the way you—" He stopped, reconsidered. "You knew from day one that I was wrong about him. You came to me anyway. You documented everything, took the warning, got dismissed, and kept the backup copies." He looked at me steadily. "Then when I came back and asked for help, you didn't make me earn it. You just helped." "That's the job," I said, though I knew that wasn't entirely true. "Daniel?" He'd used my first name exactly once in 6 years when he introduced me to the new CFO at an onboarding lunch. I noticed it now in a way I hadn't then. "I've been working in the same building as you for 4 years, he said, "and I spent most of that time looking past you. I'd like to stop doing that." Outside, the DC skyline was settling into its nighttime geometry. The lights on the Key Bridge were reflected in the Potomac below. In the morning, there would be HR meetings and compliance documentation and the operational aftermath of everything we'd dismantled this week. But right now, it was just this hallway, and this man, and a question that was forming itself in the air between us with the unhurried patience of something that had been waiting a while. There's a restaurant on M Street. Bourbon steak. I've had a standing reservation I never use. A pause. Friday. I looked at him. 4 years of maintained professional distance, 1 week of late nights, cold coffee, and the kind of trust that only gets built in the dark when everything is on the line. Friday, I said. Something shifted in his expression, not the relief of a man who'd gotten what he wanted, something quieter than that. The particular stillness of someone who has been holding something at arm's length for too long and has finally let it come close. We walked back into his office together to finalize the compliance documentation. I sat at the secondary workstation. He sat at his desk. We worked in the same comfortable silence we'd developed over the past week. Somewhere in the building's server room, Marcus Webb's access credentials were being flagged for permanent deactivation. Kevin Marsh's network quarantine had already generated an automated HR alert. The Morrison contract was signed, sealed, and scheduled for announcement Monday morning. I reached for my keyboard. "You're looking at my hands again," I said without turning around. "I know," Ethan said. He didn't sound apologetic about it. I started to type. 4 years of looking past me. I had spent all that time in the 14th floor office, in the architecture of wires and logs and systems that made everything in this building run without anyone noticing. I'd watched from the margins while Ethan Cole moved through this company like someone who had built it from intention alone. I never thought I was waiting. I wasn't the kind of person who waited. But I think, somewhere in the background processes of the past 6 years, something had been running quietly. Patient, thorough. The way the best security systems work. Not aggressive, not loud, just steady and present and ready. The trap had been set for Marcus, but the thing it returned in the end wasn't just justice. I looked down at my fingers on the keys. Steady hands. That's what he'd said. Maybe that's all any of this had ever been. 2 people, each in their own way, trying to hold things steady in a building with moving parts. And somehow, in the middle of a sweep for listening devices and a honeypot built for a traitor, finding that the person next to them was doing the same thing. Friday was 3 days away. I had work to do. I got back to it. The end.